Welcome everybody to this event from talking about socialism from a Marxist perspective. Today we're going to be discussing socialist strategy and the environment. My name is Will McMahon and I'm going to be facilitating the event. How this event came about was that I wrote an article which was a challenge to people about socialist strategy. I wrote it in the middle of May, and it was just after the Monza Grand Prix had been wrecked by flooding in northern Italy. And what prompted me to write that article was the fact that the World Meteorological Organization had recently published findings about what's happening to the environment. And it had a couple of facts in it which struck me. First one was the chance of at least 1 year between 2023 and 2027 exceeding the warmest year on record is highly likely, 98% likely. And secondly, the chance of the 5-year average in the same period being higher than the last 5 years is also 98%. And the position of this organization was that we have a severe environmental crisis on our hands. And one argument about this I put, which is that capital cannot help itself. Capitalism cannot help itself because it's based on growth, which is why during general elections, people talk a lot about growth, because that's what capital needs. And the question that we face is not one about morality, it's one of confronting the dull compulsion of the capitalist economic system that needs this kind of growth to survive. It's not about individual consumption. It's a much bigger problem than that. Actually, it's a big structural problem. And so when we think about, for example, everybody switching to electric cars, we're all going to go on to lithium batteries, apparently. And what we know about lithium is that it's a highly prized asset. There are going to be inter-imperialist wars to get hold of it. And it's actually going to cause a lot of economic devastation digging it out of the ground. Now, the other thing that prompted me to write it was the book by Andras Malm, Fighting in a World on Fire. And he argued that climate crises are unfolding with a series of interlocked absurdities, that it's easier to imagine the ending of the world than the end of capitalism, and at least for some to imagine learning to die than learning to fight, and also to resign oneself to the end of everything one holds dear, than it is to imagine considering militant acts and resistance. Now, I thought that was quite an interesting way of putting it. There are, of course, various routes out of the environmental situation we find ourselves in. One of them might be, for example, the continuation of capitalism with severe mitigations. And as the world kind of heats up, the ruling class globally, and in particular in Western Europe, tries to insulate itself from what's going on around it. So, for example, they start taking mitigation measures. One example is the French recently said, if your trip is less than 2.5 hours by plane, you can't fly. And so one might have a process whereby ruling classes do that. It might be possible that they could introduce mitigations, which mean that they're okay, but the poor, working class and the peasantry across the globe are less okay and more impacted by the environment. There might be a way out for them. So I think that we have a really serious question to answer, which is that, we have become kind of paralyzed, I think, politically, the socialist left by this. The environmental campaigns are led by mainly people from the middle classes, people with an environmental but not a class perspective. The best that we've been able to do is the Green New Deal that came over from the United States as part of it was taken up by the Corbyn project. And it's not as if we haven't had opportunities to make our point. I mean, in May, when I wrote the article, people were talking about the energy crisis and the energy companies. More recently, we've had the crisis around water and the despoilation of rivers. So there's been lots of really obvious points that socialists could have made about how capitalism is the problem here, and we need to have an environmental socialist movement that can challenge it, but nothing. I can't see anything. And so the question for Marxists, I argued, is what is our strategy in response to these failures? How do we articulate a program of social change that persuades those who are resigning themselves to the end of everything they hold dear, rather than considering militant acts and resistance as the way forward? Now, that was the challenge. I thought, what's the strategy? And I'm really pleased to say that Gary Ostrolenk took up the challenge and is going to be doing an introduction this evening. He's going to talk for about 15 minutes. And then what we'll be doing is we'll be having a discussion, and talking about socialism, we like lots of different people talking. So everybody gets 3 minutes, and then we can go around again to have a conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Gary Ostrolenk now and say, Gary, what is the socialist strategy for the environmental crisis?
Thanks very much, Will. So there have been times over the last 10, 15 years where I felt that Marxism has got very much on the back foot in its response to the emerging campaigns against the environmental crisis and around global warming. And part of that, I think, has been a vague idea that Marxists can't think beyond the growth imperative that has driven capitalism, and that therefore, in a sense, Marxists are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Meanwhile, I mean, there's no doubt, as Will alluded to there, that the environmental campaigns have been predominantly petty bourgeois and liberal, and to be honest, have held the working class in contempt in large part. They've been moralistic, they've sought individualistic solutions, they've focused very much on consumption and the choices, so-called, that consumers make in what they consume. And they've focused on, I mean, sort of, really, their philosophy has been one of self-denial and abstinence. So we've heard, you know, often we've heard how there's too many brown babies being born around the world, to demanding scarce resources. We've heard how there's too much industrialization in the global south, too much dirty industrialization. We've heard how too many people are going on holiday abroad, often with, you know, sort of an undercurrent of they're going on holidays that are worthless because they're just getting drunk on the Spanish coast. We've heard about too many people choosing to drive, choosing in inverted commas, and too many people lazily buying things in plastic packaging. It's been a very middle class and individualistic and consumerist approach to the crisis. Then we've had Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil focusing very much in their direct action, effectively on obstructing working class people going about their lives, jumping on underground trains in the rush hour, blocking busy roads, instead of focusing their guns on the people and the corporations that are responsible for pollution and for heavy use of carbon-based energy. Now, we know as Marxists that very few people have genuine choices about what they consume. For the vast majority of the people around the world, they are just getting by, however they can. And I do think that the slogan, Just Stop Oil, is tantamount for the vast majority of people in the world to saying, just stop living. Cheap carbon-based energy, in reality, right now, underpins most human activity. So there's a tension here, there's a problem. And unfortunately, I feel that many Marxists, and certainly many people on the left, have tried to tail end these reactionary campaigns. And I do think they're reactionary. And I think that the left has lost a class-conscious clarity and direction as a result. So I kind of wanted to take the opportunity to go back to basics a bit here. Go back to Marxist basics. And I mean, if we start off, let's remind ourselves of Marx's vision of human liberation through communism. It's a world enabled through an abundance, plentiful products, created by ever more powerful productive forces, owned in common. Now, I do think it's worth emphasizing, well, certainly I believe in growth. I think growth is an essential enabler of communism. Growth doesn't mean ever more pollution. Growth doesn't necessarily mean ever more use of carbon-based sources of energy. But I do believe in growth of the productive forces, and that's still being required to enable communism. And I don't want to move away from that. And I don't want to move away from that Marxist vision of human liberation. I think it's also worth remembering that capitalism has paved the way for communism through its vast expansion of productive forces. I mean, that's what we believe in as Marxists. But then also, it's worth remembering that Marx did actually think quite a lot about the interaction between humanity and the environment, and particularly under capitalism. Capitalist production disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth, he said. And capitalist production develops technology only by sapping the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. So he was very conscious of this issue and this tension in our use of the environment, both as an enabler and as something that could trip us up. Now, I mean, let's remember that capitalist growth has been entirely dependent on cheap, reliable, and mobile carbon-based sources of energy, coal, oil, and gas. There would have been no capitalism without it, right? It's just an ABC of how capitalism has come about. And as a result, all the benefits of capitalism, and they barely, you can barely even characterize those benefits. All science and technology, all culture, all the comforts of our lives, insofar as we have them, certainly in this country, most people have lots of comforts. Those are all down to the development of capitalism. And the environmental impacts of carbon-based fuels are an inevitable consequence of that huge advance of human civilization under capitalism. In a sense, I'd have to say it was worth it, right? Whatever the impacts might be looking like, capitalism, I don't regret, right? And I don't think we should regret capitalism. I think it would be utopian and idealistic to slip into that mindset. So the question, I think, really is, who can achieve the changes that are necessary to move away from carbon-based energy? And I think that, I think we'd all agree that the anarchy of capitalism shows itself incapable of the planning and the investments necessary over and over again, right? It is clear that capitalism is just not touching the sides when it comes to fixing this crisis. Now, the thing is, so capitalism can't do it. Who can do it? And I think probably we'd all agree again, as Marxists, that it's the working class that can do it. The agency of the working class in achieving communism was, realizing the agency of the working class was the point at which Marx's thinking became scientific rather than utopian. And that applies here as much as ever. But it does require the development of class consciousness in struggle, and in struggle from self-interest. The vast majority of people across the world are already living desperate, impoverished, and super-exploited lives. We can't achieve that development of consciousness and confidence through sacrifice. We can't ask the working class to pay the price. We can't ask the global south simply to halt the development of its productive forces. We can't ask working families juggling multiple jobs, childcare and school runs, and barely able to feed their children and warm their homes to sacrifice good jobs. So I think for me, this is a really fundamental tension that we have to think through. Counterposing climate change action with working class interests opens the ground for right-wing populists and fascists, right? And we have to focus on developing that consciousness and that confidence in struggle, self-interested struggle. So, I guess question to coin a phrase, what's to be done? Well, of course, as revolutionaries, I think we have to be very clear in our analysis, in our propaganda, and in our program that the economic and social transformation away from carbon-based energy can only be achieved through the working class taking political power and owning the means of production. In other words, through a communist revolution. But that doesn't mean we have nothing to say in the here and now about what needs to be done. It doesn't mean to say that we don't make demands and put pressure on capitalist governments and corporations. And it doesn't mean that we don't join in united front campaigns with reformists around those demands. For me, that's the ABC of revolutionary method. So, we demanded a shorter working week, factory safety, decent benefits for those out on work, and we worked with and through the trade unions to achieve such reforms. In the process, we gained opportunities to grow class confidence and to offer leadership. Even in COVID, we demanded government measures around use of masks, imposition of lockdowns, and provision of vaccinations. These were reformist measures and regulations, but they were in the interest of the working class, and in fighting for them, we exposed the disinterest, callousness, and hypocrisy of the ruling class and their political representatives. So I think for me, the question is, what should we be demanding and fighting for? And around what demands can we form united fronts with reformists? And I haven't got time to go into great detail, but just very broadly, I think the first thing is we should be saying nobody should have to die as a result of global warming. We have the wherewithal, the huge wealth in the world, and the technology to build infrastructure that can prevent floods, to switch from monocrop strategies that cause forest fires, to relocate communities where necessary, to build homes that can either be cool or warm, to collect, store, and distribute water adequately, and so on. So there are many things that capitalism is not going to fund, is not going to sort out to protect working class people from the impact of climate change, and we should fight for that. Second category I would suggest is most obviously the investment, the planning, and the development of alternative, cheap, green energy at scale. Capitalism ain't going to deliver this. It never has. It never will. It's just impossible. And it's a huge project. There's a huge investment required, but the wealth is there to do it, of course. And the third thing, I do think it's important to demand tighter regulation, both because that exposes the role of the corporations and constrains their impact, and because it's in the interest of the working class to have greater regulation. Even though it doesn't solve the problem, it's something that we can fight for and that has an impact. And I think working class people can understand and join in with all three of those types of action. But I do think there's a type of action and demand that we can't fight for, we can't espouse, and that's the demand to stop investments. Just Stop Oil is essentially all about stopping investments, stopping new airport capacity, stopping new transport infrastructure. In all these cases, we end up pitting environmental campaigners against the working class that's desperate for investment and for good jobs. This undermines class confidence and unity. Capitalism will not achieve a non-carbon economy, even if we succeed in stopping a new runway, a new train line, a new motorway, or a new oil rig. Conversely, a confident working class fighting for and winning better jobs and better infrastructure is far more likely to take power. So I think actually we have to be clear that we cannot form a united front with campaigns like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, where they are essentially and above all else seeking to stop investment and to stop the use of carbon-based fuel without the development of an alternative. And the term just transition, right, which has been used a lot, and I do think it can be a useful propaganda tool. Of course, we have to be clear that there can be no such thing as a just transition under capitalism. So the demand for a just transition is simply a tool for exposing the inadequacy of all reforms within capitalism, rather than something that we think can be delivered within capitalism. So I hope that sort of prompts some thoughts and discussions and debates. I'm sure there's lots of disagreements about it. And I'll close there, Will. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. And well within time, so well done. Okay, let me take our first speaker, or if you have questions or whatever, contribute in whichever way you want. Of course, there's the chat as well. So could I ask for the first person who wants to contribute for 3 minutes? Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Will, and thanks very much, Gary, for quite a provocative introduction. In 3 minutes, I can't take up all the points that I want, but I'd just like to throw a few ideas out to help the discussion get going. First of all, I think there's a real difficulty in posing the or contrasting or defending the development of capitalism because of where we've arrived at. There are two sides, aren't there? Of course, capitalism was a tremendously productive mode of production. It's now in its dying embers and it needs to be swept away. But of course, it's massively developed the productive forces. But I think we've got to be careful that we don't essentially justify capitalism and everything that it brought with it because of that. And I think that there was an element of this in some of the things that you were saying, because workers have achieved various things. would we defend slavery on the basis that we got tobacco, sugar, coffee, cotton? We have to separate out the social poverty, social degradation, deaths, disease, etc. Humanity has benefited massively from the production of rubber, but do we defend Belgian imperialism in the Congo for having made that possible? So there's two different sides that I think we've got to be careful we don't mix up. The second thing I just want to say is global warming. I think from a socialist point of view, I consider the socialists, in a sense, the most advanced consciousness of humanity. We see what's necessary and we have an idea about how to change things. And the science on global warming, as far as I've read, it's absolutely overwhelming of one view, and that is global warming since 1850 has happened as a result. I mean, the papers, the scientists, they call it human activity. But if you look at those dates, it's capitalism. And so global warming that we've had in the last 150 years is a consequence of capitalism. And global warming is a fact. I've been told to wind up. I was just going to, unless we start from the position that global warming and climate catastrophe is a fact, I think it's very difficult for us to work out how to proceed. I'll just, okay, thank you.
You can come back later, Nick. We got Chris.
Evening.
Chris,
thanks, Will. Yeah, there's a lot of what Gary said that I actually agree with. I think it's interesting what Gary was saying about XR and just stop oil. I think I have 2 points really on that. First really is to defend them in the sense that they are currently the great bogeyman in terms of protest movements and what have you. And the laws that are being put against them, the different police measures that are being taken against them, you know, affects us all. And I think one of the things that we should be saying in relation to them, whether we agree with them or not, is that a bit of inconvenience is well worth a great deal of democracy and freedom of assembly. My second point is actually to agree with Gary that some of their politics are reactionary. They're Malthusian, for green austerity, for degrowth, you know, for controlling the population. And what Gary said about, you know, we can't win essentially by offering less than what is on offer today, I think is a point that we should all consider. Nick was obviously right that the ecological breakdown, climate change is a proven fact. And for me, it's a class issue. We have to approach it in a class way. In that sense, we need to demonstrate that what we offer is to transform the productive force that capitalism has left for us towards providing a good life, good opportunities for us all, and in a way that is sustainable for life on Earth. Yep. Thanks, Will.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Ian.
Good evening, comrades. I just want to make a case for the centrality of the abolition of wage labour. There doesn't have to be a conflict between growth and the continued provision of the means of existence for people, not just existence, but comfort. And there's so many things that people need, particularly outside of the imperialist countries. But it's the centrality of the abolition of wage labour, first of all, as a demand that we should be putting forward alongside any kind of environmental demands. But also, it's just logical. how many jobs do people do that are completely worthless? All of banking and international finance, the police, the courts, that whole tons. You could almost kind of get wage labour down to about 10 hours a week now in a rationally organised society. So that in itself means you don't actually have to consume that much in the way of fossil fuels. Plus, we also need to be kind of realistic about. I mean, look, we just recently had people round to try and sell us, solar panels on the roof, and of course it works out prohibitively expensive unless you're going to be in the same house for 10 years and you're going to never need to replace one and all the rest of it. Well, all of that could be provided. Remember, we're talking about a society where all production is to meet human need. They're not. So solar panels, for example, could be on every single roof in the country. All production is purely to meet human need. They don't have to make a profit, so we just make the bloody things. And that means, of course, there's going to be a complete change in the way people work, the kinds of work that people do. The kind of needs-based areas that absolutely have to be done. I mean, someone's going to have to care for old people with dementia, or someone's going to have to go there. I mean, Marx famously used to reply to people who say, well, who's going to go down the drains? And he would reply, well, you will. But someone's going to have to kind of sort stuff out. And of course, that's what we'll do. But does anybody mind what you do if you've got to work 10 hours a week? And of course, it would completely transform the way fuel is used. I mean, the lockdown for COVID was fascinating in so many ways, because it showed that, well, we didn't all just suddenly die, or it was possible to actually control things, and how many people whose lives were saved because they weren't killed in road traffic accidents, and the sheer absurdity of everybody having to have a car each. I mean, why would you, if you could abolish wage labour and you just did your necessary labour, then it could be within walking distance of your home, and the nature of homes would change. Communal society would produce a different type of home. It's not accidental that terraced houses are the form that was thrown up by industrial capitalism. It would be a different sort of housing. We tend to think of the need to. There's so much of British farmland, for example, which could be rewilded. I mean, miles and miles of thousands of miles of hedgerows have been ripped out in my lifetime. So just a few thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to call on Soraya, but if other people want to speak, and I do encourage people to speak or to make comments in the chat, because it's a very open session. This I think there's going to be an interesting discussion and lots of different points of view, actually. So do put your 10 pence in. Soraya.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, for the introduction. It's raised a lot of interesting points, and how we intervene in the issue, and what sort of demands we put forward, and really what has made me think about what do I want to, what do we want? Because I think it's right that it's almost a luxury to be able to sort of follow this being the plan B, and it's a false impression that's given, isn't it, that in fact you can reform, that these things are possible without getting rid of capitalism. So I think that's our starting point, that we have to explain that you can't have you can't save the planet, to use those terms, with capitalism, because capitalism, as we know, can't resolve the problem that it created, because it's in direct conflict with what capitalism is about. It's right that capital is always open to exploit new resources, and so the idea of lithium batteries and so on. But I mean, I'm very superficial. I wouldn't even say I have a superficial knowledge. I just have a superficial hint of something in relation to electric cars, because that's not, lithium batteries are in themselves, I understand, quite water intensive in actually getting to the lithium. You know, that doesn't seem to me superficially to be the answer to everything. And it's a question of whether capitalism wants to invest in that. Is it going to make a profit from it? So of course, it's not. We can't relinquish it. And I think that a lot of the protests, but we do have to consider how to intervene, because although Gary pointed out it is a to a certain extent sort of middle class, almost appears as a luxury to be able to have these things when basically you're trying to get by. A lot of young people, understandably, are very concerned about their future, and that means working class young people. So it's not enough just to say, oh well, you know, it is what it is. I'm not saying anybody is saying that here, and it seems to me that it is complicated, and I don't have the answers, and I would welcome what comrades have to say about what we say concretely, because I think that there's been, obviously science is in the hand of capitalism, and I don't think solutions that there must be are accessible to the ordinary working class person, and so it's, if there are comrades who have that expertise, who have knowledge of it, that would be very helpful, so we can pose the arguments. But I think it's something that is not, in terms of it in the unions, for example, you know, we don't if there's a suggestion to go back to nuclear power, would we be in favor of that? People, yeah. I know the unions of some of the unions have been in favor of things because they're thinking about the workers. We've got to put forward the arguments, haven't we, that new jobs should be created, but not at any cost, and not sort of posing new jobs or no jobs.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that, Soraya. Steve, you're on. You need to unmute.
Yeah, I'm mute. Yeah. Thank you very much. For me, I'm not an expert on all these rewildings and processes that actually need to take place. But for me, what I read and what I see, and like, you know, Pacific Islands potentially going to go under the sea, and these heat waves in America, this 40-degree heat. Personally, I can't do a heat above 22. So, but these heats, probably 20, but anyway, these heats above 40 we had here last year. For me, this issue, probably above all others, even potentially transcends any issues, any discussion around the transitional program and all that, because I think there is only one solution here, and that is the socialist revolution and an urgent seizure of the means of production for us to begin some of this stuff that you know, the more clued up comrades on this issue are involved in, and then bigger and wider experts, because unless we're able to do that, and we're able to do that in a short to medium term, then we really have lost all opportunity. So for me, it is an urgent task that we must be advocating that the only answer to this is the actual socialist revolution. There isn't a halfway house under capitalism. I think, you know, Nick pointed out these figures have rocketed under capitalism. They are to blame. There's some reports that you read. I find it quite depressing to read, but there are some reports you read that they knew about this as early as the 60s and 70s, and did nothing, which they clearly wouldn't do because it would destroy the profit motive in their system. But it really, for me, is the one where we, and the other aspect of it for me is it's a real internationalism. And I think there will begun, and there are already, but there will be more demonstrations, uprisings in the global south, as we like to call it now. And we will need to be, as socialists in sort of Western Europe, Marxists in Western Europe, we will need to be ready and prepared to be able to fully support those struggles materially and, you know, with guidance if necessary. You know, you might even see in America or, you know, Mexico or wherever, even here. And we really need to be in a position to be able to explain that there is no way out. And, you know, for the global south that are really going to come under pressure, we need to be prepared that there are going to be genuine, potentially revolutionary movements around the issues of climate change and the effects it's going to have on their way of life, possible ending of the whole ways of life, and capitalism cannot provide an answer to that. And I think we need to explain that, you know, this quote of Engels and Luxemburg, the socialism or barbarism. And I think we really are staring down the barrel of a gun, and it is socialism or barbarism. And I'm not sure whether we can rely on the capitalists to reintroduce nuclear power or rewilding. And I'm being wound up, and it's socialism or barbarism. I'm going for socialism. Thanks, Will.
Hey, thanks very much. Okay, I'm going to say a few things, just make a few comments, and then I'd really like it if Kat or Kirsty or Janet, John or Bob, if you've got any contribution to make, please do come in or ask a question or put something in the chat. That'd be great. I've got your raised hand, Nick. Just some initial thoughts from me about it, which is that, I mean, I think it's incontestable that there is a scientific consensus around the impact of CO2 on the climate and the impact of industrialization on the climate. And actually, you know, the Soviet Union played its role in that. Yeah. At one point, they were trying to reverse rivers. You know, they were doing all kinds of strange things. And so I think it's industrialism, but now capitalism is the main form of industrialism. And I think one of the things to take into account is that I think when Marx was looking at the rise of capitalism, he both saw its amazing productive forces, but he also recognized what a huge threat it was to the natural environment. And I'm not sure that he would have seen an ever extending production across the planet as a good thing, actually. And I think towards the end of his life, he recognized that in another way, capitalism was a monster that was going to really drain the planet of resources, and that was another reason to do something about it. So I think that's important. I think that I was talking to a friend of mine actually today about this, and he has teenage kids, and he says they are at a very low ebb, because in their heads they can see a climate crisis that nobody appears to be able to do anything about. And they have no confidence in people like Just Stop Oil, you know, or Extinction Rebellion in being able to change it. And they don't see in their heads any change agent. And actually the working class is the change agent here. It's a really important change agent. And we have to work out how we can do that without any moralizing or without talking about personal carbon footprints and all that kind of stuff, because that is simply not a way forward. The final point I would want to make is that the people who are going to bear the brunt of this crisis, which is unfolding quite quickly, I think now, unfortunately, are people on working class and people on low incomes and the peasantry and the landless across the globe. And so they're going to be fighting a battle against a ruling class who don't want to take the measures that are required to stop the planet going into a severe ecological turn downwards, I think. And that's where the class struggle should be, and we should support them in that. And we should build global coalitions which recognize that that's really what's going on here. I'll stop there. Okay, over to Kirsty actually has made a comment. Hi, Will and Nick and everyone. We have to get all the big businesses to pay for this, like the damage that their companies have damaged the environment, such as electricity and gas. And the Industrial Revolution caused a lot of climate change, as was spoken about. Thanks for that, Kirsty. I'm going to pass over to you, Nick.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to say that I did agree with a lot of what Gary said. That's the first thing. I agree with the criticisms of some of the Green campaigners about making it moralistic and individualistic. I don't agree with the Malthusian approach to the problems of humanity, as Chris pointed out. However, the fact that we've got this global climate catastrophe is actually an indictment of the socialist movement and the labor movement, that we haven't taken it up in the way that it needs to be taken up. And the fact that other sections in society, and particularly young people, are taking up the question of climate catastrophe is something that should really spur us on to develop our ideas and make our case. Because the only force in society that can stop global warming or begin to stop it and potentially to reverse it before it gets too late is the working class. And it comes down to the question of property and property relations. And we cannot expect, except through revolutionary action and force, that the ruling class, the capitalist class, will do anything. They won't do anything that impedes their ability to make a profit, which they do out of the burning of fossil fuel and utilizing that in all aspects of profit, rather than looking for cheap alternatives. The only force that can do anything about that is the working class. And the only ideology, if you like, that can do anything about it is socialism, and getting rid of the need to make a profit and actually planning production on the basis of need. And I take Gary's point about we can have a society of abundance, with Ian's point where you could reduce the working week. We could stop production of so much that we produce at the moment, which is unnecessary, and produce things that we do actually need. But we are the only class, the only force in society that can actually, coming to power, plan production on the basis of need. That's human need, which takes into account the impact on the natural world, which capitalism completely ignores, and we're paying the cost for it now. So I think we have to be careful how we take up young people and sections even of the middle class who are inspired to do something about climate change, because we've got to put forward our arguments. You can't control what you don't own, and therefore common ownership of the means of production on a global level is absolutely essential.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for keeping to time. Soraya.
Yeah, well, just on the last thing that Nick said, that I think we need to really point out to young people that there is no common approach, as in this sense that there's a section of society that cares about the well-being of all mankind. It's really reiterating there is a class division in society and the consequences that flow from that. But I stuck my hand up because I don't know what is the Malthusian approach.
Who wants to explain that one?
Too many people in the world.
That's basically it, yeah. In Spencer. You're on.
Thomas Malthus argued that if you...
Yeah, you're a sociologist, aren't you, Ian?
Yes.
So fill it out a bit on the Malthusian.
Early political economists who tried to argue that if working people get paid more, they simply reproduce more, and so there's an inherent tendency towards human misery. I mean, there are some very obvious demands we could make with regard to energy and water and all the rest of it. Firstly, they have to be renationalised insofar as we put it forward as a kind of demand in the meantime. Arguably, nationalisation is of itself, of course, nothing particularly socialist about it. However, we can point to the fact that Thames Water has been an utter debacle. It needs to be not only renationalised but also free. Why should you pay for water any more than you should have to pay for food or housing or anything else? We're ultimately in favour of removal of all commodity production. I'm also opposed to the idea of a sort of a strong green state. I mean, what I'm really worried about, in a sense, is that, of course, as the climate crisis lays waste to great swathes of the earth and sets about vast migrations of people, it's going to affect everybody. So far, what we're seeing really is the effects of imperialism, apart from anything else, and that has to be properly addressed too. We have to say that it's not just capitalism, but the way in which capitalism operates to super exploit the poor of the world that is leading to this catastrophe. And one of the consequences of that is that people are being emptied of vast areas of the world. And they have to go somewhere, and they have to be treated humanely, and they are our brothers and sisters. I don't care if someone comes from Somalia or Southampton. And the other thing is, I mean, just even about exploring different forms of energy. You can imagine the use of battery cars. I mean, it's just produced another kind of bonanza in how to produce another load of cars that we don't, actually, if you look carefully at it, how many miles do people do in a car every day? No reason why it couldn't have been used to produce hydrogen, for example, or a whole range of other possible. But it wouldn't be, because it wouldn't be as profitable. So again, we come back to this question about the abolition of commodity production. And my fear is that the crisis caused by migration, or the supposed crisis of migration, is going to lead to a demand for, as it were, a strong green state. We already see green arguments being put forward for raising taxes on poor people. That's what it amounts to. And that's something that has to be fought against as well. The idea is that somehow it's we who have to pay for the catastrophe that's been brought on us by the ruling class. And it's just making that very clear. I'm in favour of working alongside people like Just Stop Oil, for example, because after all, okay, yeah, they do stop workers getting to work, but so do demonstrations, and we've all been on a few of those in our times, and so do strikes and a whole range of other things. But we don't quibble about that. But we do need to have that conversation with them. I don't think it's a particularly useful thing to just climb on top of tube trains. We'd be better off working alongside the workers who drive them.
Yeah. Well, and on that, Ian, actually, when in the early 90s, I don't know whether people remember, but in the early 90s, there was, and I'm going to bring you in a second, Gary. Yeah. In the early 90s, when there were big road protests called Reclaim the Streets, people complaining about traffic in London, the people from Reclaim the Streets made an alliance with the leadership of the RMT around the provision of public transport rather than individual use of cars. And I thought that was quite an interesting initiative, actually, at the time. Over to you, Gary. Always difficult to respond when you've heard so much, I know, so take your time.
Yeah, no, it's a good wide-ranging debate. So where to start? I think, I'm going to start with what Nick said about it being a danger of sounding as though you're justifying capitalism, right? So, or justifying and defending aspects of capitalism. Now, I don't think it's about defending capitalism. It's about understanding the realities of capitalism, how it's developed, how it could have developed. And I don't think it's the same as defending slavery or defending imperialism, or indeed defending wage labor and exploitation. To be honest, I think that if the working class had been in control from the beginning, and that's a utopian imaginary situation that doesn't really make any sense, but just a little mind game. If the working class had been in control from the beginning, the working class would have used carbon-based energy. It empowered the development of the productive forces. So it is very different to slavery and to imperialism and to wage labor. I want to understand the role that it has played and understand the role that it still plays right now. Now, there are lots of different catastrophes around the world right now. Horrendous catastrophes, horrendous crises in terms of wars, migration, pollution, in terms of devastation of environments for all kinds of causes, in terms of hyper exploitation, super exploitation of workers, in terms of people being forced into unemployment without cover, in terms of the complete breakdown of healthcare in all kinds of places. There are many catastrophes. And if we are not careful, if we lose a sense of balance, right, in how we talk about and address climate change, alongside those other catastrophes, and take into account the struggles that people have in dealing with those catastrophes, then we risk losing the working class. We do, there's no doubt about it. I mean, regressive taxation, just as an example, is at risk of losing the working class to the populist right and to the fascists. And we've seen that around various measures in London recently. Malthusian ideas are incredibly prevalent. I really think they are in the green movement, without people often even realizing it. The idea that the problem is the growth of the population is really commonplace amongst liberals, right? And people get into this when they lose, when they get into sort of focusing on there being a catastrophe of climate change and it being a different order of magnitude to everything else, and not rooting the struggle that we need to build across all of these catastrophes. I think that we have to actually look to science and technology as being a big part of the solution here. I mean, that's what we believe in, isn't it? We believe in science and technology as solving our problems. I still do, right? I think that science and technology can solve the problem of global warming. It can enable the development at scale of cheap energy. I do believe, actually, that we have to look seriously at nuclear power now, just as an example, but there's lots of other science and technology that needs to be developed with massive investment. And the bottom line is that people do actually want a relationship with nature, a close relationship with nature. People do want to live as part of nature, but they also need to live. So, okay, I'll stop there.
I'll bring you in again. I'll bring you in again at the end. I know there's a lot. I know. So Kat has put in the chat, is it necessarily the case that the working class would have used carbon-based energy in this way? What do you think about Andreas Malm's arguments in Fossil Capital that it was the dynamics of capitalism and profit-driven expansion that led to the triumph of fossil capital over water power? So that's an interesting question. Who am I going to bring in now? We got you. Go on, Nick. I'll give you another go.
Well, don't call me if there are other people.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So this is it's a really interesting. It's probably the first time when we've had a sort of a bit of a disagreement developing, because, and I think I do have a disagreement with Gary's approach. I agree that Malthusian ideas are reactionary. I agree that blaming individuals is reactionary, and I'm an opponent of green politics because they are basically capitalist politics, and we see where green politics takes people, takes them into the government and into wars in Germany and elsewhere. So having said all of that, Gary says that he's interested in science, but the science tells us that global warming is increasing. And notwithstanding the fact that the capitalist governments have set targets, those targets are not going to be met. And so I agree with Steve, actually, that it poses, perhaps most starkly, the question of transforming society. And it may not be as sharp for us living in the UK, but the largest sections of the world who have the biggest impact of global warming are the poorest parts of the world. If you take Bangladesh, something like a quarter of Bangladesh is only 7 foot above sea level. And what global warming is doing, it's warming the ocean, which means that it expands, it means that it rises. The ice cap in the Arctic is melting. We have wildfires developing in Siberia and Asia, to a degree that we've not seen before. It's causing absolute catastrophe, which is on a par, if not worse than the catastrophes that Gary has mentioned. So it's not a question of having a competition about what sort of catastrophe is the worst, but the question is, what are we as socialists arguing to do? And I think that we have to actually pose the argument very sharply that capitalism cannot resolve these problems, and we have to find an alternative. Now, the working class, if it develops its class consciousness as an international class looking for international solutions, I believe I agree with Kat's question, actually, that it would have, and it will do in the future if it comes to power, take cognizance of the impact of the decisions that it makes on every single part of the globe. And so it would invest and look to different solutions. And I don't think it's an answer to say, because we've achieved a standard of living now based on fossil fuel, we've got to continue doing that, which I think is really what Gary's saying. And basically, you could be accused of ignoring global warming, which is driven by the burning of fossil fuel. You can't have it both ways. Either there's a crisis and it can be changed, or it's not.
I'm gonna interrupt you there, Nick. Okay, thanks for that. Let me take your hand down. So let me lower your hand. So Kirsty says maybe we have to have more action rather than blah blah, as Greta Thunberg would say, as time is running out for the planet. I'm just going to put come in at a slightly different angle, which I alluded to before, in terms of my thinking around it. Right, I think that Marx was onto the possible alliance between what had happened in terms of industrialization and countries that were agricultural and could major on agriculture, and that you could have a global system that met the two. Because I don't think he would have supported industrialization throughout the globe. I think some of that thinking actually went on into the kind of the Marxists around the Russian Revolution and the necessity for an alliance between Russia and Germany, a successful German revolution. There was a lot of economic thinking about that and how you could relate to, and it would be mutually beneficial trade and organization under a socialist system. And I also think that that issue is posed now, actually, because I don't think the assumption that everybody should follow the path that was followed by capitalism in Western Europe, or even capitalism in China, I have to say, needs to be replicated across the rest of the world. Under a socialist society, you would configure and organize things completely differently, I think. And I kind of, sometimes have concerns because, where Engels, the conditions of the working class in England, he said it's shit. It's terrible. Study in Manchester was about how much social murder actually capitalism required. And of course, that also carried over into imperialism, which was an ecological disaster for the global South, just an ecological disaster for the global South. So I think there's that side to it. There's another side to it, which is I really agree with Gary about technology and science and bringing to the table, the best peer-reviewed science that we can to produce a different kind of outcome to the issue that we're facing at the moment. And what's really concerning about that is if you look at the summary for policymakers, COP26, Glasgow, there's a big summary offered for policymakers in COP26 by scientists who said, look, these are the features, these are some of the things that we need to do in order to turn this situation around. And there were 20 basically pieces of censorship on that summary that didn't make it into the public document. And surprise, surprise, many of those things that the scientists were coming up with point to a socialist solution. But the capitalist governments wouldn't have it. And so I think science is on our side. And I think building alliances with scientists around this is a really important thing to do, because a lot of them can see what's coming, but don't have any levers to pull to make any change, I think, from their point of view, and they don't quite know what to do about it. And the working class is their ally in that. Ian Spencer says our standard of living would not decline. An end to community production an end to commodity production would mean we could develop in any way we want. Okay, have we got any more? Have we got the hands up? Or have we exhausted ourselves? Chris. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Will. I'll have another go. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to pick up what Nick said about you have to put forward your arguments and what are we as socialists arguing to do. I think those are that is the most important question, really, in a sense, for us as communists and socialists. because what we have been doing for the last 10, 20 plus years, probably more, we have not been arguing for the kind of change that is really needed. We've got along with labourism, broad movementism, you know, even radical movementism, you know, Will alluded to Reclaim the Streets in the 90s. So we've got along plenty of time for push forward ideas that really do not challenge what Ian was talking about when he was talking about abolishing the profit system, abolishing the wages system. So I think for us, what we need to do is be confident that we have an alternative that is far better than what is on offer from any of these green movements, or, you know, the corporations that are covering themselves in as much green paint as possible. You know, that we have an idea of how to stop and to restore ecological breakdown. And one of the things that helps us in that, and this is some way in support of what Gary has been saying, is that the ill-begotten gains of capitalism must be used to transform and build a society of abundance and freedom for us all, what we call communism. That is a hard argument to make, because as Nick has pointed out and others has pointed out, Kirsty in the chat, for example, you know, that involves the great horrors of the last 200 years that we have to then explain how we've ended up at a place that is ripe for a communist future, that makes the possibility of a communist future realizable for all of us alive today. Thank you, Will.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, Janet, are you okay to speak?
Yeah, because you persuaded me
Okay.
privately. Although I'm really tired, partly to do with gas central heating. So I don't want to talk about gas central heating. It was just something off the wall, really. I mean, I could say who I agreed with and who I didn't. I agreed with lots of what different people said, but it was just something about really Just Stop Oil and some of these other, whatever we call them, activist motivations, or I don't know what we call them, but and I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist now, and I don't know if I believe this or what I believe about it, but I mean, there is a possibility, not about the people, you know, young people or anyone else who's, you know, walking along the streets or throwing confetti or whatever they're doing. I don't think they are not doing it out of the right motives. They may have the wrong strategy, but I think their motivation is good. But in terms of, you know, maybe it's about greenwashing in a sense. Who funds Just Stop Oil? Who funds these people? And it is quite murky, really, about who funds them. So all I'm saying really is, should we take them at face value? I mean, even though we're saying that you know, it's not enough, and some of the people are saying we should support them, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, I don't know. But and somebody mentioned Greta, what's her name, who has been very, you know, busy lately going to Kyiv to promote the war and to promote support, you know, what's happening in Ukraine, which seems to me a very contradictory, I know she's young and possibly naive, but a very contradictory message for somebody who's talking about meeting the challenges on the environment, of climate change, to be promoting wars. So, but these other people, I don't know who funds them, and I think we have to be, there has to be some question marks about their reasons for what they're doing. But I might be wrong about that. I might have just been reading, you know, the wrong people who are accusing them of all kinds of things, really, saying that some of them are, you know, they started as anarchists and so on, and they are doing this for reasons that are actually in favor of capitalism, not just not against it, or not putting forward a solution or a socialist solution, or not understanding the wider political context, but actually are counterproductive, and that they're doing it as part of a stemming the danger of people really opposing what's going on. That's it.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, I have to say that I'll just bring myself in slightly. I share some of those concerns, Janet, actually. I think that any environmental campaign that focuses on individual consumption is deeply problematic. And because it's just pointing at the wrong target. You know, I mean, I have absolutely no idea what the point is of standing on a snooker table and throwing around some purple dust, or doing the same in a horse racing, or doing the same in any other place. I mean, it's almost become performative. And that's a useful way of protesting, and I don't think it is, actually. And I think one of the things that Marxists could do usefully is to actually strategically intervene into these movements and say, stop doing that. This is not the right way to do it, and these are the kind of things that we should be doing, and we should be targeting, you know, the energy companies and all these people, but in a way that includes the majority of the population. And, you know, chucking around purple stuff ain't cutting it. And I think maybe if we could get our arguments together and think about a strategic line that had purchased, then we'd actually, I think, make gains, because in the end, you know, most of the strategies that we see being deployed are not working. They're just not working, and they have no traction, and the whole thing is just rumbling on. And that's because I don't think they have a class perspective. Now, we might have disagreements about what that class perspective is and what the strategy of it should be. But I definitely think that we need to come up with campaigns that are capable of intervening in the right way on a class basis. One of the things that I think we need to really take into account is that, I mean, I think, Nick, you were saying about, you know, it's going to impact on the global south, and it is, and I agree. But actually, if we look at what happened in France 3 or 4 years ago, thousands of elderly were killed by a heat wave, you know, and there's going to be more of that. And it's going to be the poor working class, the lower sections of the working class with the worst conditions, who are going to be impacted by this stuff, you know. And so I think it's really going to impact on the you know, Europe, United Kingdom, United States. It already is. And there has to be some way of us leveraging that into a mass movement where socialist politics are at its heart. I just can't see why they wouldn't be. I just don't think we've worked it out. I think that's my frustration. So Ian, I'll bring you in a moment, Nick. Ian said the state is becoming increasingly determined to stop direct action, especially when it's directed against companies which are carrying out atrocities such as Elbit, which is Israel's biggest arm manufacturer. Yeah, don't disagree with that. Nick?
Yeah, I agree with what you've just said, Will, in terms of we need class-based campaigns for the idea of the working class taking power. And I agree with most of the criticisms that's been made by comrades about the type of protest, but I do think that we need to be a bit careful, because all of the arguments that have been raised about, for example, throwing confetti or throwing purple, this, that, and the other, people could say, well, what did the suffragettes do? You know, throwing yourself under a horse and stuff like this. All protests actually, in a sense, are undemocratic when they start, because they start by a minority doing it. And actually, I just go back to my original point. It's a failure of the labor movement and of the socialist movement to take up this issue, which has allowed other people with not a class outlook to take the initiative at this stage. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. And I agree with your last points, Will. It's not, I made the point earlier, but it's not just the global south. Of course, it's not. It's young children now in the streets of London, Manchester, Sheffield, who are getting asthma and all sorts of other diseases because of the pollution in the air, and so on. So these are working class issues. And if we as the socialist movement are also the salvation for humanity, they are humanity's problems. And we've got to find a way of linking the economic crisis with the climate crisis and bringing the two together by pointing out that these are consequences of the class nature of society and the ownership of the means of production in the hands of a few who don't care tuppence for the environment or for the people. And in a sense, it's almost like the ruling class has lost confidence in its own system, and they're basically fiddling while Rome burns, or they're partying while the planet burns. They don't care so long as they have a good time, they're making their profit. They don't really care what comes afterwards when they've gone.
Yeah, thanks very much. Gary, I'm gonna ask you to come in and make a few more points.
Okay, thank you, Will. So I'm not sure whether this is getting to the summing up point, but I'll just say a few things and we can see where it goes. So first, I think it's a really good point, Janet, that you made about Greta Thunberg. I mean, the mere fact that there's a young person who is supporting war, who is part of this movement, is in itself a huge worry and concern, and says something about the movement, I think. I mean, it's not that there aren't lots of young people enthusiastically and passionately concerned about climate change that's a problem. It's the ideology and the values that are kind of embedded through this movement that's a problem, and it has a class basis. There's no doubt about it. It would be very hard to argue that it wasn't a primarily in this country, primarily a South-based, middle-class-based movement, and it has ideas that correspond to that. It has values that correspond to that. I mean, I agree, Will, that we absolutely need to engage with and vocally oppose the arguments and positions of these campaigns, but I don't think we should be actually joining them and intervening from within, because I think it's very important that we separate ourselves and differentiate ourselves. Otherwise, it's almost like you'd end up going in and infiltrating the Liberal Democrats or something like that. I mean, I wouldn't be in favor of infiltrating the Green Party, for instance. So I think it's about differentiating ourselves and opposing their positions rather than trying to influence them from within. Nick, I must admit, I'm kind of scratching my head a bit, trying to work out what it is that we're disagreeing about. Okay, so I absolutely agree that it's imperative that we move away from carbon-based energy as soon as possible, and that in order to do that, we invest in what's required to do that. I agree that that's what we should be saying in our program. I agree that that's what we should be saying in our propaganda, that only a revolution, only the working class can deliver that outcome. The question is, and by the way, what would I do the day after the revolution if I had any say in it? It would be to make a massive investment in the science, the raw science, the applied technology, and the manufacturing that might deliver the kind of alternative energies that we need, right? And that is exactly what capitalism ain't doing and is not going to do. That is the thing that only central planning by the class can deliver. But, you know, science can deliver these things. Science can sort this out with the appropriate investment and planning, no problem at all. The trouble is, it's not going to happen under capitalism. So the question is, what should we campaign around while we're still living in capitalism, apart from agitating for a revolution? Because we can't just agitate for a revolution. We have to campaign around issues and around demands. And I think that's where I've tried to articulate the demands that enable us to work with the class and develop the class and its confidence and consciousness around demanding a massive investment in the science and technology that's needed, around demanding the investments that would protect people from the ravages of climate change in the here and now, and around demanding regulation that would highlight the culpability of the major corporations and constrain them a little bit. Those feel like demands that we can clearly make and work with the class to achieve, at the same time as insisting very clearly that only revolution can solve this problem. What I don't think we can demand, and I've said before, is things like just stop oil, right? Which pit the environmental campaigners against the working class. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that that pitting is going on. The question is, how do we take people with us? And several people have mentioned this. I think it's really important. And who do we take with us?
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to take the trade unions with us? Are we going to take the working class with us? Or are we going to take a little bit of a caricature, but are we going to take these middle-class kids from London with us and antagonize the working class, right? I'm being a bit provocative there, but you know what? You know where I'm coming from. And one final thought, sorry, is, you know, part of my point is that there are multiple things. There is a long history of agricultural practice that is appalling, with huge pollution, use of antibiotics, effluents into rivers and so on. That's nothing to do with global warming, but it's an environmental crisis and that we should be grappling with. The problem of asthma and air pollution, actually, I don't think it's got anything to do with global warming. It's got to do with a lot to do with car technology and particle output from cars. It's also got a lot to do with damp conditions in housing, right? And that's a crisis that absolutely we should be fighting here and now. That's a catastrophe. I don't see Sadiq Khan as the least bit concerned about it. He gets some nice sort of marketing capital from the congestion charge or the ultra low emission zone, but he's actually not tackling the fundamental problems for asthma.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Gary, can I just take up that question that you raised there and ask people, who do they think we should be bringing with us? Who should be in the alliance that we're trying to build? Do we want the middle-class kids from London? Are the trade unions actually always going to go along with this stuff? Because you get resistance from trade unions, particularly when it comes around jobs and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I've seen it in the arms industry. Nick?
Yeah, all of these subjects throw up so many questions. To answer your question directly, I'd have middle-class kids and try to persuade them of the arguments for socialism. And they could be won to the ideas of socialism and a working class perspective. So I don't think we should write people off, particularly young people, because they may be middle class. But obviously we want alliances with working class organizations and the working class generally. That is the class that has the power. Middle class, actually, what does that mean for middle class kids? Are they the children of teachers or social workers who are workers? I don't know. We need to be a bit careful. Secondly, and it goes back to something that Gary raised earlier, trade unions do not necessarily, and actually largely do not have a socialist perspective. They have a narrow trade union outlook, which focuses on, number one, protecting their own members. And sometimes that leads, in my opinion, to reactionary politics. And we saw that at the TUC at the end of last year, where GMB and Unite, my union, supported a motion and pushed it through the TUC, calling on the government to invest more money in the production of arms. Now, that's not something that we could support, in my opinion. We have to oppose that. And I think that there are aspects of production and jobs where there would be it may be correct for workers to take a different position. I'll give a little example. A working class community and the local council or the government wants to build an incinerator at the end of the road, but it's going to create jobs. What position do we take? It's not straightforward, and you can't always say, because there are going to be jobs and everybody will be better off, that's the right position to take. We have to take a broader outlook and look at the consequences overall and involve democratic decision making. So these are issues where there's not necessarily a straightforward position, and I disagree with Gary over the fourth runway at Heathrow.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna bring in Kirsty's comment here, which is issues should be a better environment for all and all life as such. For education, health and housing, in some places in Britain, we have damp in houses they live in. And Janet says those local jobs often turn out not to be as local at all. So, I mean, I'm going to kind of slightly draw us to a close here. If people don't want to, you know, people have any more thoughts about the people we should be building alliances with, that'd be good to hear them. I have to say I agree with Gary when he was talking about the different kind of climate and environmental crisis we face. I think that's really important because COVID was actually an environmental crisis. And there are across the globe, there are whole monitoring centres of scientists who are waiting for the next outbreak as we chomp our way through forests in Brazil and Indonesia and in China, and we disturb the ecosystems, and those kind of things are producing the kind of viruses that could actually kill quite a lot of us if we get really unlucky. There's also the crisis in the seas, there's soil environmental crisis, there's lots of different, I think environmentalists list 12 different kinds of environmental crises that we're going through at the moment. And it's truly astonishing. So we need to it's a massive subject. But I think that, you know, it is kind of quite important to think about the alliances and who we should be building them with and why. And I would actually like to continue this conversation in a written form, because I think it deserves more time and more thought and more discussion. And maybe we should do something like that on the website, on the Talking About Socialism website. Anyway, Gary, I'm going to give you the final say, because you've been very patient as people have been chucking things backwards and forwards, and you've been listening very patiently.
Well, I think I've said what I had to say, to be honest.
Okay.
In my last contribution, that was effectively a summing up. So I don't want to.
All right, that's okay then. I just didn't know whether you were bursting to kind of have something to say there. All right then. So thanks very much for attending. Talking About Socialism as a series of events. We've got one coming up in a month about broad parties. We're still doing a bit of head scratching about our next one in a fortnight, and you'll get a bulletin about that. And by the way, by all means, pass on the bulletins to people you know might be interested in these sessions. It's always good to have different views, different ideas, Marxists arguing different positions and thinking issues through, and that's really what we're after. We're after a Marxist debate about how we can overcome capitalism from a whole series of numbers of perspectives, one of which is the environmental crisis we face. Okay, I am going to say thanks for attending. Gary, thanks for your introduction. Brilliant.
Thank you, Gary. Very good one.
Really good. And thanks for everybody's contributions. And I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you at the next one.